wanted to really have you on because there's a piece you wrote. It's a little bit old at this point. It's back from January, but of last year, 2023. But it deals with something that I've been thinking about a lot since this stay was issued in the case against California's sensitive places restrictions, the gun-free zones that really effectively bar gun carry altogether in California, even though, the Supreme Court, that was the core holding of Bruin, right? Was that the Second Amendment covers the right to bear arms, to carry guns in public for self-defense. And now it's actually harder to do that in California than it was before Bruin came down. And at the same time, these legal challenges haven't played out the way I think a lot of gun rights advocates would have liked, obviously. But also, there's something more. We'll get to some of that, I think, later on in the show. But first, I want to talk about this concept that you laid out in this piece called the asymmetry of legal liability that faced, where essentially people who are subject to these laws could defy them because they're likely unconstitutional, right? And you've seen a lot of federal judges come to that conclusion. Not all of them, but a lot of them in the last year and a half since they started becoming enacted. But there's a lot of risk that goes along with that. Whereas the lawmakers and law enforcement officials who are responsible for these prohibitions really don't face much risk in enacting them, even though they do seem to go directly against what the court has held. So can you just explain this concept a little bit more, this asymmetry of legal liability here?
Yeah. So just as a quick preface, the states that were formerly may issue states are replacing their may issue laws with extensive restrictions on where individuals may carry firearms. There are kind of two sets of restrictions that are happening right now. They're the so-called sensitive place restrictions that say don't carry a gun in a bar or restaurant, and they're piling on as many of those locations as they can think of, hospitals. And then there's the second thing that's even more extensive, which what they say is changing the default private property rules to say guns are not allowed unless they are expressly welcomed on the private property. I don't think that's what these laws actually do, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole at this moment. We can discuss that later. But what the combination of the two basically means, when you combine the two, there is nowhere that you can basically carry a gun. When you ask the sponsoring legislator, where you can carry a gun, he will forthrightly say maybe a few sidewalks.
Yeah, and you've seen that in multiple states, right? The governor of New York said that about their law.
Yes.
And also, I believe one of the sponsors of the California legislation said exactly this. You can't carry anyway. At least that's how they envision it.
Yes.
But sidewalks. Sidewalks, really. Not even.
And the ironic thing here is that the laws now are much more strict than before Bruin happened. If you're in San Francisco, getting a permit was extraordinarily difficult. But there are a lot of places in California that you could get a permit. And once you got the permit, you were pretty unrestricted in what you could do. So they have replaced the system where people could choose where to live and thereby get permits with a system that is basically a flat ban for the entire state. And as far as the asymmetry of risk goes, they are backing these location restrictions with felony level penalties. New York, carrying in a prohibited place comes with the same sentence that carrying an unlicensed gun did before Bruin was decided. So, usually when you have these sensitive place restrictions, there are a few places that have felony level penalties, often, sometimes courts, often schools, but most are kind of misdemeanors or infractions, especially if you have a license. But what these states are doing is backing it with felony level penalties. And what they're doing is they're putting gun owners at enormous risk, that they're basically saying the whole state is off limits. And if you get caught in one of these places, you will be tagged with a felony, and maybe you'll go to jail, maybe you won't. But at a minimum, the felony penalty comes with enormous collateral consequences, including loss of a right to own a gun. And so naturally, this is going to deter people because the Second Amendment jurisprudence at the federal level is still somewhat new and underdeveloped. And so there's not a body of case law that you can rely on to say this is unconstitutional. So from the gun owner perspective, a gun owner faces felony level penalties basically every time he carries a gun off his own premises. The same liability is not true for the state officials. Through various doctrines, legislators have absolute immunity for their legislation. And it is not the writing of the law that is the constitutional violation. It's ultimately the enforcement of the law that is the constitutional violation. But police are protected by something known as qualified immunity. So if you try to sue for a violation of your constitutional rights, the courts will not allow damages to be laid against the individual officer unless the law was clearly established. And this is again a problem because this area of law is new and few things are clearly established right now. And so the Supreme Court, with the conservative justices in the lead, have said that you can't hold individual officers liable unless the law was clearly established, by which they mean the officer either knowingly violated the law or, is basically plainly incompetent, as the court has said. And that's a very high bar to meet under any set of conditions, and it's especially a high bar when you have a novel area. Now, you might be able to have a federal prosecution for willfully violating constitutional rights, but number one, the Biden administration is not going to do that. And number two, again, the mens rea here is very high, willfully. You generally have to show that the officer violated a known legal duty. And the officer is going to say, well, we don't know what sensitive places can be lawfully restricted and can't. And so when you add all this up, it's having the effect of deterring people from exercising their rights, because on the one hand, gun owners face felony level penalties. And on the other hand, the government officers who are enforcing the law are shielded by various doctrines. And so, right. It's kind of in a situation now where you have to be a little bit risk preferring to exercise your rights in California or New York.
Yeah, and a number of other states too. New Jersey and Hawaii, and some of these other places that have passed these broom response bills.